Hello and welcome to another edition of A Chat With. I'm your host, Sam Macbeth, and we have another special edition of A Chat With today. With me is the author of Rock and Roll Unraveled, Derek Shelmerdine. Derek, how you doing, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing very well, Sam. Great to be back with you. What a great topic. What a great guy, little Richard.
Yeah, and he is quite the enigma. He is a potpourri of emotions and styles and personalities and all that. Um, let's start off at the beginning. He was born December the 5th, 1932, and
That's
he
right.
passed away May the 9th in 2020.
Yep,
And he had, as you well know, and most of the listeners know, a plethora of hits over the course of his career, but most of them were at the beginning of his career. So, what do you say? That's where we begin, and let's talk a little bit about Little Richard. How did he get involved in what became rock and roll?
well, it's interesting. As you say, he's born in 1932. Richard Wayne Penniman, and he often used he used the name Penniman for his writing credits because the guy wrote an awful lot of his material right the way through his career. And he was, interestingly enough, born with one leg shorter than the other. So,
Really?
yeah, it gave him problems in some sense. And it had quite an effect on his life. I mean, his parents were, his father was a church deacon and a bootlegger, which is interesting. He had his own bar, the Tip in, and his couple of his uncles and grandfather were preachers. So a bit like Jerry Lee Lewis, religion ran through the family. And when he was about 10 years old, so we're now around 1942. He formed a group called the Tiny Tots Quartet, very much a gospel type group, singing in church. And as you can see, 10 years old. And then he had a bit of a disagreement with his parents, and he was sort of thrown out the house when he was 14 or 15. But his real first break probably came in about 1946. So, I mean, the guy has been really going for a long time as a singer, and he was working in um, the Macon City. He's born in Macon City, Macon, and he was working in the auditorium there, selling refreshments. And Sister Rosetta Tharpe was playing there one night, and Little Richard was obviously singing in the background while he was working, and she heard him and invited him to come up on stage and sing a couple of songs before she went on. So, it was his career was really starting way back before he got into the whole rock and roll thing. And what's really interesting then is the sort of second half of the 40s, end of the 40s, he was in a number of different traveling shows. He was in what the first one was Dr. Nubilo's traveling show. And that particular guy was an over the top kind of performer. And Little Richard met a couple of these colorful characters. And I think they really shaped his image of what he became on stage. Because to say he was flamboyant is a bit of an understatement. Then he was with Dr. Hudson's medicine show when he started to perform songs like Caledonia, Louis Jordan's big hit. And that's really when he started to perform R&B rather than just gospel. He sort of, because there's a very fine line between R&B, I think, and gospel. And his parents thought that was sinful, to say the least. And other traveling shows he was in, this is all across the sort of late 40s, very early 50s. Sugarfoot Sam's Minstrel Show, Tidy Jolly Steppers, Broadway Follies. And what's interesting is I mentioned that he was born with one leg shorter than the other. And one thing I've seen him say in interviews he's been giving is when he was a child, he preferred to play with the girls rather than with the boys. And this now started to come into his stage act, as it were. Joining some of these traveling shows, he performed as Little Richard, as himself, though he probably wasn't called Little Richard at that point. And he also performed as Princess Lavone in drag. But one of the problems he had, because he had one leg shorter than the other, it wasn't easy for him to dance or to walk around in high heels. So you can see, his whole background is starting to move very much towards the performer that we know and love. And his nickname came around in sort of 1950-ish. He was singing with a band called Buster Brown and his orchestra. And because of his small, lanky frame, he had a sort of overly large head as well, slightly. Um, he gave him the name Little Richard. And I think Little Richard liked that, and he kept that as his name for the stage name for the rest of his life. But his break came really when he met a guy called Billy Wright, an R&B singer in the 40s and early 50s. He had a handful of R&B hits in the late 40s, early 50s, and he coached him. And it was Billy Wright, known as the Prince of Blues, who coached his image very much and got him into the whole pancake makeup, pencil thin mustache, and very stylish stage wear that we came to see and love in the rock and roll years. And the real break in his career came when Billy Wright introduced Little Richard to a DJ called Zenas Spears. And Zenas entered Little Richard in a talent competition, and the prize was a recording deal with RCA. And on the 16th of October, 51, Little Richard won that and was in the RCA's recording studios, recorded his first four tracks.
So basically, it would be safe to say that he felt he had the performance gene in him from a very young age, and he wasn't shy, so he was able
Absolutely.
to perform in front of people, and he was talented from a very young age with
Yeah.
the amount of travel that he did as a young boy with these various shows. Now, with these shows, you said he did some of the stuff in drag and some of the stuff as himself. Was a lot of it gospel, or was it at this point that he was switching to the R&B end of it?
This is really, I think, where he was developing his R&B singing. That was real, and that's obviously the stepping stone into the rock and roll world. So he was transitioning, with a very religious background, and his first singing group as a toddler with, the Tiny Tots. It was then his career started to develop, and his first single, "Taxi Blues" and "Every Hour." It got some local success, but it was never a big success. He recorded four singles all told with RCA, and he wrote three of those four B-sides. Didn't write any of the A-sides, I don't think. So, his writing career started as soon as his recording career started, basically. And RCA lost interest because they were getting nowhere, basically. And in '53, he joined Peacock singles across. I mean, he carried on recording right up until just before he died, basically, and he was on literally a dozen or more record labels across his career. But Peacock was the second one, and it's an interesting one that. 53, he released a single called Ain't That Good News, coupled with Fool at the Wheel. And that was released as Deuces of Rhythm and Tempo Toppers lead. Little Richard is the credit on the single. And his second single in 54, Always, coupled with what I think is one of the best titles for a song I've ever seen. Rice, Red Beans, and Turnip Greens. Now, what a great title that is. But for any record collectors listening, that particular Peacock single, I've seen at the time in a couple of label designs. One was a red label. And what's interesting, they give different artist credits. The red label credits it to Tempo Toppers featuring Little Richard, and the blue label just has Tempo Toppers with no reference to Little Richard. So that's an interesting one to hunt down for the record collectors amongst us.
Yeah, that is. I wish I had known about that. Maybe I could have tried to track it down for the show. But we do have a couple of songs that we're going to be playing as the show goes along. We started off with Tutti Frutti, one of his first hits. In fact, I believe that was his first hit.
Yes.
But when did the transition begin from R&B into what became rock and roll in the 50s? Like, uh, is there a story behind that transition? Like, did he see somebody, or was there he heard something, or was it just something that he felt?
Yeah, I mean, there is actually a nice little transition there. That's Peacock Singer was 54. In early 55, he met Lloyd Price, who'd had a few hits of his own at that time, got on very well with him. And Lloyd Price was on the Speciality label. So we're now coming up to the golden age of Little Richard. And he met Lloyd Price in Macon, where he seems to meet a lot of people in the early days. And Lloyd Price suggested that he send a demo tape to Art Rupe, who was the owner of Speciality Records in LA. This he did, and didn't hear anything for a while. But then Bumps Blackwell, very big figure in Little Richard's early recording days. He was a talent scout for Art Rupe's Speciality label. And Art Rupe had asked him to find someone to compete with Ray Charles, who was obviously a major player at that particular time. So Bumps Blackwell started to look around, and he came across the tape that Little Richard had sent into the studio some months earlier, heard it and thought, oh, this is good. And he invited Little Richard to meet up with him in New Orleans. So now we're very much, Speciality, of course, is the record label where he has all those early hits. And it was the 14th of September, 55, that he recorded Tutti Frutti. But that very nearly didn't happen. But they met at the famous JM studios, Cosima Matassa's studios. And the audition wasn't really going too well. And I saw a great interview. So this is a quote straight from Bumps Blackwell about that particular recording session. And he was disappointed with what he'd heard compared to what he'd heard on the demo tapes. And the quote is, he was thinking, if you look like Tarzan and sound like Mickey Mouse, it just doesn't work. And what it was, obviously, Little Richard was holding back. He wasn't letting rip. And so it was around lunchtime. So they decided to go out to lunch, and they went to the Dewdrop Inn. And the Dewdrop Inn had a piano. So now Little Richard, completely home, he had an audience, he had a piano, and he started to play his club version of Tutti Frutti, which very, very raunchy lyrics. And
Would that
Bumps
be the version
Blackwell,
that we know and love?
no, what, no, it would be the origin of the version that we know and love. What happened? I mean, because it's got lots of rude innuendo and
Ah, gotcha.
a little bit close to knuckle here and there. And what happened was Bumps Blackwell recognised he had a hit on his hands there, but the sensibilities of the audience wouldn't be able to take the lyrics. So he brought a lady called Dorothy Labostri in, and she worked on the lyrics and cleaned them up. Basically, if you look at the record label, she gets a joint writing credit with Little Richard Penniman on the single. And he signed a record deal around about now, and he was paid half a cent per record. I mean, that did result in a lawsuit decades later. But can you imagine? I mean, you look at artists nowadays, they have a hit record and they're sort of millionaires. And this guy was paid half a cent a record. And that was an R&B and a top 40 hit. It was a number 2 R&B hit, number 17 Billboard top 40 hit. But what's interesting is Pat Boone comes into the picture now, because Pat Boone was regularly, if you look at Pat Boone's hits in the sort of mid 50s, most of them are covers of black R&B artists, very sanitized versions. And he
Did he
recorded
not
the
do a
hit.
version of Tutti Frutti?
He did, and he had a bigger hit. Little Richard was 17 on the Billboard Top 40, and Pat Boone's got to number 12 on the Top 40 Billboard chart. It was a hit in the UK as well, a little later. But what's interesting is the lyrics were cleaned up originally for Little Richard's, and if you look at the writing credit on the Pat Boone, it's got Labostre Penniman and a guy called Joe Lubin. And apparently, Pat Boone brought him in to clean the lyrics up just that little bit further. But that was very much the what was happening at the time. An awful lot of the early rock and roll, like Elvis. If you look at his Sun singles, most of those are covers of either country artists or R&B artists. And just one other thing on Tutti Frutti, if anybody's hunting around and come across a 1938 song called Tutti Frutti from a couple of guys called Slim and Slam, it's just a completely different song, a very jolly sing along, Tutti Frutti, you can imagine,
Yeah.
kind of song. Because I remember when I was researching this or some while ago, and I came across that and I thought, oh, wow, this must be some kind of original version. And no, it's absolutely nothing to do with it.
That's awesome. Now, at this point, he's got the sound. Has he got the look at that point? Like, has his shows started to get to be the exciting shows that we know at this point, or was he still kind of laid back when it came to the actual performance?
No, no, but by now he has developed, he started that image earlier. So the pencil thin mustache and the makeup and everything. No, this is the little Richard that we know and love now. I mean, he did change across his career. Well, we'll hear shortly. He renounced rock and roll completely. I mean, as you say, he had his second hit in '56, Long Tall Sally. And that's got a story behind it as well. Again, Bumps Blackwell was doing that. And it was a lady called Anortis Johnson who brought the song to Bumps Blackwell and Little Richard. And it was a story of, her family story of theirs. And Little Richard and Bumps Blackwell turned it into the hit Long Tall Sally. And Bumps Blackwell suggested that they speed it up to prevent another Pat Boone cover. Well, they did speed it up, but it didn't prevent the Pat Boone cover. He had another hit with that as well. Although this time, Little Richard got to number 6 and Pat Boone only got to number 8. So there was a little bit of justice going on there.
So it's safe to say that at this point, Little Richard is making an impact. Um, is this around the time that rock and roll exploded, so to speak?
It's
With
very
like
much the
Bill
time.
Haley and Fats Domino and all those cats. Is this the point that's happening?
Oh, 1956 is very much the year rock and roll exploded. What happened was rock and roll. The first rock and roll songs usually it goes back to 1951 with Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, Rocket '88. But where rock and roll really exploded was with uh, Bill Haley and his Comets. When the song Rock Around the Clock was used behind the opening credits for a movie called Blackboard Jungle. And that was really when it exploded onto an unsuspecting world. But it was 1956 that it really became the international phenomenon. I mean, Elvis left Sun Records at the end, November-ish of 55, signed up with RCA, recorded Jailhouse Rock in January. It hit the top 40 Billboard in the March. And then Elvis's career just went on a massive ascendancy. In the December of '56, on the Billboard chart at the end of December, he had 10 singles on the Hot 100. So this is very much 1956, Rip It Up. Tutti Frutti was 55. Long Tall Sally was 56. It was very much when rock and roll was starting out. So, Elvis and Little Richard, because Jerry Lee Lewis isn't really quite on the scene yet, I don't think. But it was very much when it exploded. And he made his first film, '56, The Girl Can't Help Her. It wasn't technically a music film. It was a sort of comedy romp with James Manfield. But Little Richard features, as does Fats Domino and Eddie Cochran. He had his first hit in the UK in '56 as well with Rip It Up at the end of '56. And what's interesting is that if you look at his hits, he only had top 40 hits between 56 and 58 during this particular period. He actually had nine Billboard top 40s, 18 Billboard R&B top 40s, and he had 15 UK hits as well. So he actually had, it's interesting, he had a very small number of actual, Billboard top 40 type hit records. But I mean, he was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the first inductions in '86. So you can see his relevance.
Yeah, and um, he had a real flair about him.
Oh,
Did
absolutely.
that cause issues with um I I don't want to say the older generation, but did that cause a lot of issues with other artists that were performing at that time?
Not so much with other artists, I don't think, but certainly you're absolutely right about the previous generation. As with Elvis, there were a lot of people thought it was the music of the devil at that particular time. I mean, with Elvis, you've got the famous, I think it was the third appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, where they only filmed him from the hips up. So he was it was outrageous, and Jerry Lee Lewis should fit in the same category as well. Those were really the three key players, I think, in the uh, golden age of rock and roll. But what's interesting, that golden age really didn't last very long, because Bill Haley, mid 1956, 55 rather, with Rock Around the Clock. On the 12th of October 57, Little Richard was over in Australia on tour. And he was on tour with Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, and a local Australian band called Johnny O'Keefe and the DJs. And partway through the tour in Sydney, around the 12th of October, he actually renounced rock and roll. There are a number of different stories, so they're never really quite sure which one is actually the reason. Some talk about a plane crash where, he had an epiphany and seeing a Sputnik that looked like the end of the world. But he reputedly, and again, there are various quotes that are used for this, but he turned to the audience in Sydney, and this is a quote from a Little Richard interview of how it happened. And he said, after seeing this Sputnik, he said to the audience, "This is it. I am through. I'm leaving show business to go back to God." And that's exactly what he did. He threw his jewellery into, some say, the Hunter River, others say Sydney Harbour, and he came back to America. And that was very much the end of his first rock and roll career. He had one more recording session left to do for Speciality contractually. So he did that, and of course his next hit was "Good Golly Miss Molly." And by the time that became a hit in February of '58, he'd already enrolled to become a church minister in the Oakwood Theological College in Huntsville, Alabama. And from then till '62, when he did return to rock and roll, he released a number of gospel songs.
Yeah, and we'll get to that stuff in our next segment. But just
Yeah.
before we finish this one off, we got about 2 minutes left in this segment. When he was at his peak in rock and roll, were there any controversies or issues that he had over the course of that time?
I don't think there were any major controversies. Um, I mean, the guy was a very over the top performer, but I don't think. Oh, before he became a performer, yes. I mean, he in his private life. I mean, that's a different story. Back in 1955, he was actually jailed for lewd behavior. Um, Little Richard actually was a voyeur. He used to like watching boys and girls having fun, as it were. And he had a friend, a lady called Fanny, and they hired this car, and things took place in the car. And he got arrested and spent several days in prison for voyeurism. I mean, interestingly enough, he also met a very attractive lady called Angel Aubrey, and he liked her. And I quote from one of his interviews again. She could draw a lot of handsome guys for me. And there's this story of Buddy Holly being involved as well in a liaison with the lovely Angel. And in '52, his father was killed, of course. He was shot in a fight, actually, by Little Richard's friend, a guy called Frank. So there was a lot going on. And so he was a controversial character, and he was getting into drugs. I mean, it's early days in the '50s, but later on, it became quite a big issue.
And so it didn't really affect his career at all.
No, not at all. I think some of these rock and roll type things do your career no harm whatsoever. You're an opera singer, maybe they might. Um, but no, it's interesting, really. I mean, the guy was obviously one of these much larger than life kind of characters, and his stage performance reflected that very much. And he was, I mean, he was from a big family. He was the third child of 12 children. So, there was a there was a lot going on in Little Richard's life. And he did get sort of bullied because of the one leg short and the other meant that he walked in a sort of effeminate kind of a way. So that all sort of built into the guy that we came to know and love.
And with that, what do you say we take a look at that hit we were just talking about that finished off this segment of his career, Good Golly Miss Molly? We'll do that right now. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of the accolades, his time as a gospel artist, and what happened when he came back to rock and roll.
Absolutely.
You are listening to a chat with Derek Shelmerdine as we take an extensive look at Little Richard. And that was Good Golly Miss Molly. And Derek, that is one of his great hits, well known by everybody. A very popular song. I understand you have a couple notes about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's coupled with Hey, 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 Hey. And he used to often perform that as a medley with the Liebestoller song Kansas City for live performances. And we're going to be talking about the Beatles later because they performed with Little Richard and they picked up on that and they recorded that as well. And it was Little Richard that helped Paul McCartney with the sort of rock and roll sounds of Hey, Hey, Hey.
Now, at this point, you said that in the last segment you mentioned that he had one more recording session that he had to do. When he did that segment, even though he had renounced rock and roll, was he professional about it and did rock and roll music, or did he try and slide over to the other side, so to speak?
No, I think it was just a binary thing. He stopped singing rock and roll, and he for the next 2 or 3 years, he only sang, well, 4 years, he only sang gospel songs. And what's interesting, he had his very much his last American hits on both the R&B charts and the Billboard top 40 charts in the rock and roll era. But interesting enough, his fame in the UK continued quite a little bit longer. He had his last UK hit in '59, Kansas City, of that initial '50s run. But what happened was that, the gospel songs weren't selling too well, and I'm not exactly sure exactly why he decided to come back to rock and roll, but he did. And the 8th of October '62, he opened a comeback tour. And interestingly enough, he had that in the UK because in the UK, his hits had very much carried on after Kansas City in '59. He had another hit in the UK in '62 with He Got What He Wanted around this sort of time. And that was produced, interestingly enough, that comeback tour was produced by a guy, promoted by a guy called Don Arden, who's Sharon Osbourne's father, legendary Ozzy Osbourne wife. And Sam Cooke was on that tour as well. It was across October 62. And a British act called Jet Harris, and the Jet Blacks. Jet Harris was with Cliff Richard's original band.
Now, at this point, we've gone through a transition with Little Richard. He transitioned from rock and roll to gospel. And then in 62, he came back to rock and roll. Did that affect his shows at all? Like, did his fans, did they, some of them stay away? Or did he have the popularity that he had the first run?
No, he never had any more. Um, well, hardly. He didn't have any more Billboard American top 40 hits at all after 1958. He had a couple of R&B Billboard hits in 65 and 70 because of other projects he was working on, and he had some more hits in the UK. So his popular, interesting enough, measured in terms of mainstream Billboard top 40 hit singles, he never had any more. He remained as popular and as respected as ever. We talk later about the fact that he made recordings with the duets with the likes of Bruce Springsteen. He recorded with all kinds of different people, and he's a real enigma in some ways, and that's one of them. Whereas you look at someone like Jerry Lee Lewis, who had the rock and roll hits in the 50s, and they dried up for a completely different set of reasons. But he came back as a country artist and had literally dozens, 50 odd country top Billboard top 40 hits. So Little Richard didn't really reinvent himself in the way that Jerry Lee Lewis did. But he was still very respected. And there's a really interesting link with the Beatles now, because on the 12th of October, he played a gig at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton near Liverpool, on the same bill as the Beatles. And Little Richard was on tour of the UK at the time, and this wasn't part of that tour. This was a very, very shrewd move on Brian Epstein's part, the Beatles manager. The Beatles had just gone into the charts with Love Me Do, their first UK hit single. And Brian Epstein thought it would be very smart move to have a gig with one of the biggest rock and roll names of all time, Little Richard, to really promote get maximum publicity for the Beatles. And interestingly, that's in Little Richard's backing band at that time was Billy Preston, who of course later appears on Get Back with the Beatles. I mean, for that Little Richard, it must have been a heck of a concert. There were 10 Merseybeat bands, and Merseybeat was massive in the early 60s. But there was only one of those bands that became a British invasion band. Well, half of them did. It was Billy Kramer and the Coasters. Now, the band that became the British Invasion Act, very successful in America in the 64 to 66 British invasion, was Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. And there's a great little story behind that. When Brian Epstein also managed Billy Kramer, saw Billy Kramer and the Coasters, his backing band, didn't want to turn professional. They were all young lads in apprenticeships and the like. So he teamed Billy Kramer with a Manchester band called the Dakotas. And it was John Lennon that suggested that Billy should add the J to his name. So Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas then became, very, very successful on both sides of the Atlantic.
Now, at this point, Little Richard he's had his run of Billboard hits. He's had his run as a megastar in concerts, that sort of thing. He's been involved. He was involved in a lot of rock and roll movies of that era.
Yeah.
Um, what is he doing to? Is it at this point that he was exclusively doing country stuff?
No, he never really got into country. What he did, he had a lot more hits in the R&B chart than he ever had on the pop chart. But what's interesting about his career was that he just got involved in lots of different sort of projects. I mentioned that he played this gig with the Beatles. Um, Shortly afterwards, they both went and played on the same stage, not together, at Hamburg. It was the Beatles' fourth Hamburg residency, and I think they were there a couple of weeks. Um, and that was where the Beatles really honed uh, their rock and roll skills with Little Richard helping Paul McCartney, particularly with the rock and roll songs. But also when he came back to America, Little Richard he toured he toured right through his career basically. But when he played Europe, he was playing not stadiums. Stadiums weren't venues at this time, but he was playing relatively big venues in America. He was on what tend to be known as the Chitlin circuit, and it was a small specialist club, so he wasn't playing to big audiences. But this is when, sort of early '63, he worked with Jimi Hendrix. Because when Jimi Hendrix came out of the army, he was with a band called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers for a while. And Jimi Hendrix was struggling to find any success in America after he left the army. And he was touring bands. He was touring band with Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, Sam Cooke. And when he worked with Little Richard, apparently Little Richard ended up, I think, effectively sacking him because Little Richard's problem was that Jimi Hendrix was also flamboyant and playing the guitar behind his head. He didn't actually invent that. But Little Richard only wanted one particular flamboyant performer on stage with him, and that was himself. But what's interesting is that he famously got called again back to the UK to support the Everly Brothers. Like the Everly Brothers, this is now the latter part of 1963, September, November. And the Everly Brothers had some hits, but their hits were drying up a little. And apparently the tickets sales were relatively, well, were quite slow. So again, it was Don Arden who was promoting this. And he again, from an interview, he rang up Little Richard and said, "Look, Richard, you've got to help me out." And Little Richard said, "Okay." So what happened? Little Richard came over to the UK, joined the tour at about the fifth gig. And it was an Everly Brothers and Bo Diddley tour. So I mean, it would have been, oh, can you imagine seeing Everly Brothers and Bo Diddley and Little Richard on the same bill? Wow, that would have been a night out. Um, so it's interesting that a lot of his success was on this side of the water.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. He seemed to have a equal or even maybe better success overseas than he did in his homeland.
Yeah.
Was that something that was just luck, or was somebody just very wise and knew where to put him?
Well, I think it's interesting. If you look at a number of American artists, they find more success in England, Britain, UK than they do in America. I mean, after Buddy Holly died, I don't think he had any more hits in America, whereas he had quite a few, obviously already recorded in the UK. And it seems to happen with a few American artists. That I mean, the Drifters, when the Drifters' run of hits sort of finished in the 1970s, they relocated to the UK and continued. And to this day, there is still a Drifters band touring. I mean, not too many of the original members now, obviously, but it is the official original uh, Drifters band. So it's interesting how maybe I don't know, the record buying publics are slightly different on each side of the water.
Did
But
little
a big
did
impact on Little Richard came around 1964 with Bama Lama, Bamaloo. Um, it was um, a reasonable hit in the UK, but I think it just scraped into the sort of 80s on the Billboard mainstream charts. And he was devastated by that. And again, so we're talking about the British invasion, which has a big impact on the music of that time. And in an interview, again, his words, he says, there were all these English groups, the Beatles, the Stones, Herman's Hermits, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and they just overshadowed my thing. So I think he got caught up in the British invasion as well. And he was finding, it was having a big impact. But it was around this time. I mean, he did release an album on VJ this time in '64 called Little Richard Is Back, but he sort of reinvented himself again. I mean, he actually, he called himself the king, and his stage act now had a scepter, a throne, and the like. And apparently, he put $16,000 of his own money into the new act. There's 17 musicians, singers, dancers, comedians, and it was very glamorous and elaborate. And this is the sort of time that Jimi Hendrix was playing with him. So it's interesting, he seems to go through, reinvent himself every now and again.
that's the thing. Like it sounds like his shows were more of like what we see today in a residency than a regular concert. A regular concert, you have bright lights and loud music, and it's good time, and everybody dances and enjoys themselves. But for him, it seemed more like an event than a show.
Yeah.
Would that be accurate?
Oh, I think so. I think as his career went, I mean, it carried on very much like that. Um, I mean, he was at Las Vegas in the March, April of 1968 at the Aladdin Hotel. And apparently there, he wore a red jacket with little inch square mirrors sewn onto it so that the spotlights of the follow spots and everything else picked it up and there'd be lights shooting off all over the place. So, I mean, he was forever the showman. And you can see his caliber as well. In September '69, Canada, there was a famous concert called the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival
Yep.
Festival. And that was people like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and also Alice Cooper, the Chicago Transit Authority, and from the UK, Screaming Lord Sutch, who found a lot of fame in the UK, but not too much elsewhere, I don't think. And in fact, that was where John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band played their debut gig. I think that came about because John Lennon was invited to sort of introduce it, and he said, "Well, I'll sort of introduce it if you let me bring my new band." So he put his band together, and he played at that. So I mean, that is quite a legendary landmark concert, I think, in its own right. 1969.
Yeah, and Little Richard had a lot of accolades over his career, not just uh, Billboard hits and sellout concerts and that sort of thing. He was nominated in '86, as you mentioned earlier, to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, the R&B Foundation's Hall of Fame, and he's also recognized in the Library of Congress in the United States, just to name a few of the accolades that he's had.
Mm.
Plus, his music is spread out in movies all over the
Oh,
place,
absolutely.
including, there's a great video that I remember seeing. I believe it was for Good Golly Miss Molly, I believe, with John Goodman from King Ralph, where
Yeah.
where where the character of Ralph, John Goodman, was a Las Vegas performer who did Little Richard rock and roll music. And that has to say a lot for an artist that your music resonates like that.
Mm.
Um, right up into to this day. Why do you think that is?
I think that the guy is just, one of a handful of people you could call iconic. I mean, I don't use that word very often, but he despite the fact that he only had a handful of mainstream hits in the 1950s, his career continued and his personality was just so big and he was just so memorable. And he kept popping back into the main light just often enough to stay unbelievably mainstream. I mean, he did a world tour in 1975. In 1976, he had a single with the Bachman Turner Overdrive. Take it like a man. So he was punctuating his career right through by working with the likes of Jimi Hendrix, Bachman Turner, Overdrive, and he just keeps popping up everywhere.
Yeah, and that's the thing. He does. I remember, I believe it was the 50th birthday for Muhammad Ali. He did a famous appearance. Uh, just as an example, like I said, his music is resonating in movies to this very day. Um, if you look back on his concerts and that, a lot of bands that are performing today take away from stuff items from his concerts. So he really had an impact on a lot of people for a long, long time, and
Absolutely.
which kind of confuses me because like he had his bulk of hits in one little small spurt, but he's so important right through his
Yeah,
entire career. Yet he
absolutely.
couldn't
I think
resonate with the listeners.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's a complete enigma in some senses. If you look at the 60s, he had all his main hits on Speciality in the 50s in America. But if you look at the other labels he was on, in the 60s, he was on Atlantic, Brunswick, Mercury, Modern, OK, VJ, some major labels, some not quite so major, but still all very well-known labels. Across the 70s, he was on Bell, Green Mountain, Kent, Mainstream, Manticure, Reprise. Again, Reprise, major record label. So, he was even though he wasn't having hits, he never stopped, apart from when he had the odd religious phase. He never stopped recording, he never stopped touring. He was just one of rock and roll's busiest um, people. I mean, just to look at the record labels, in the 80s, he was on Elektra, MCA, and Warner Brothers. You can't get much bigger than those labels. And then effectively it stopped in the 1980s. If you look at the releases for the 80s and onwards, they're mostly re-releases of
Old
things. There
hits,
wasn't an awful
yeah.
lot of material coming out after that. But he was still incessantly on the road. I mean, it was 86, the first ever Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was chosen to be inducted along with, the absolute cream of the industry.
Yeah, and if there's anybody who that is deserving of that accolade, it is Little Richard. We talked about Elvis, we've talked about Jerry Lee Lewis, and we've talked about Little Richard. Those are three very iconic artists in the birth of rock and roll. And as this series goes along, we're going to be touching on a few of the others. Like we'll be doing the Beatles coming up in a little while. Chuck Berry, Fats Domino. There's so many out there. But just before we go, we've got about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
Um, do you have any final thoughts on the career of Little Richard? For me, um, the thing that I appreciated was that he was able to differentiate his rock and roll from his religion most of the time. Like you
Yeah.
said, he had spurts when he got deeply religious and renounced. But I think that he truly understood what rock and roll was, where a lot of critics just thought it was the devil's music.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, rock and roll is one rock and roll. Little Richard is one of the absolute landmark characters, pivotal characters. So much of the music that followed, particularly the presentation style, was very much down to Little Richard. He's one of the most important people in rock and roll history, I think. You don't have it doesn't have to all be about hit records.
No, to this day, I find myself once in a while going on YouTube and checking out some of the old videos that he did. And what I really appreciated about him was that he found his niche and he didn't shy away from it. He
Hmm.
knew what he wanted and and he went with that. And I think that's something that should be applauded. And
Hmm.
I'm glad that his career went as long as it did, and he was able to entertain the people that he was.
Absolutely.
So, with that, we've got time for one more song. And Derek, I want to thank you for taking your time as usual for this episode of A Chat With. And have you got somebody in mind that you'd like to talk about, on the next episode?
I thought the Beatles might be interesting, but the pre-Ringo days would be good fun. I mean, basically in the UK at the end of November 1962, the Beatles recorded "Please Please Me," their second UK hit, and you could argue that that was the first proper Beatles recording session because multiple recording sessions for the first single, "Love Me Do," and I thought it'd be really interesting to take a look at the early Beatles career up to the point at which Ringo joined them. But there is an awful lot to talk about there. I mean, they go through some very interesting stages. They go back to 1956, 57 when they were really starting to come together. So, I think that'd be a good fun to talk about.
So, with that, I want to thank you for taking some time for me. My guest has been author of Rock and Roll Unraveled, Derek Shelmerdine. Derek, thank you for coming on the show. Thanks for talking to us about Little Richard. And I look forward to catching up with you in a couple of weeks for another edition with a look at the early Beatles.
Brilliant. I've really enjoyed it.
I hope you guys had a good time and enjoyed the show. We look forward to hearing from you. Be sure and take care, be good, love each other, and we will catch you on the flip side. Take care, be good, love you all. Bye bye.